Welcome to another episode of This Catholic Life. Conversations about life's ups and downs, big and small, how we deal with every situation imaginable, whatever life throws at us, but still manage to be sensible, practical, and joyful. Today's show is East meets West, in a world where everyone thinks all Christians are the same, unless they're actually in a particular Christian group. What is this East and West thing? When we say Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, what do we mean? I'm your host, Peter Holmes, and today I'm joined by Father Antonius, previously a medical doctor. He served as a parish priest, or has served as a parish priest of Archangel Michael and St. Bishoy. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, well done.
A Coptic Orthodox Church in Mount Druitt in Sydney, Australia, where we first met, I believe. Since 1991, he's been there. He's a researcher, lecturer, and author in philosophy. He's married with 2 children and a number of pets. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
A pleasure, again. And also, a guest is Sam Kaldas, who is one of those children, if I'm not mistaken. Director of Research and Philosophy, lecturer at St. Cyril's. His research interests range over a wide set of questions about the interface between Orthodox theology and philosophy, both ancient and modern, and so they're both well equipped to discuss this topic. Before we get started, just a reminder that if you like the show, you should subscribe on your podcast app, and that way you won't miss an episode. Let's get right into today's episode, East meets West, and a short clarification of terms. By the West here, I'm talking about Western Christianity, which seems to be mostly Roman Catholicism and its offshoots, in which I include Protestantism, which is a protest from usually Roman Catholicism, and takes most of its base ideas from that movement. But we're talking here about Eastern Christianity and a particular kind that my 2 guests represent. So I'll leave it up to perhaps Father Antonius to give us a brief definition of what we're talking about. First, about the East, in terms of Eastern Christianity, and then specifically where you're coming from.
Sure. So Eastern Christians are actually a quite varied bunch. They would range from the Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Bulgarian, etc., and include uniate churches with the Roman Catholic Church, so the Maronites, the Melkites, and so on. And then you have the Oriental Orthodox, distinguished by rejecting the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. That's the group that we belong to, the Copts, with a few others. And not to be forgotten, the Assyrian Church of the East, which at one time, a few centuries ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, was actually numerically the largest part of the Christian church and spread all the way to India and China, and sadly has declined significantly since then. So
right.
we belong to the Oriental Orthodox. That's the Copts, the Syrians, the Armenians, the Ethiopians, Eritreans, and the Indian Orthodox.
Wow. Now, you said they're distinguished there by not accepting the Chalcedonian definitions. I'd have to admit that while I've studied those definitions in theology, there wouldn't be a lot of Catholics who would know what you're talking about, A, and B, be able to even identify what would particularly bother them about that particular difference. Do you think that's not the only difference, clearly?
It was the original difference that caused the split in the church. And it was basically over the question of how we speak of the nature or natures of Christ. So on the Chalcedonian side, on which the West sits, they speak of 2 natures of Christ, the divine and the human, united in such a way that you cannot distinguish them, you cannot pull them apart from each other. On the non-Chalcedonian side, the Coptic side, we speak of 1 nature of Christ, which is, however, made up of the union of the divine and the human in a way such that you can't really pull them apart from each other. And it only took us 1,500 years, that's pretty good in the Christian church, to actually officially realize that we were kind of saying the same thing all the time, which is what happened after a series of dialogues in the 70s and 80s. And finally, the 2 sides actually officially agreed we say the same thing on this question. But
right.
Over the 15 centuries, a few other things obviously have popped up that are now keeping us out of communion with each other.
When it takes us 50, and I do say us because there's 2 sides to the equation of agreement. But when it takes us as Christians 1,500 years to agree on something, usually we get that done and then we say, wait, what have you been up to in the meantime? And we've got a lot of other things to talk about.
That's exactly it, Peter. You've captured it.
I'm afraid that this is this is only a very minute sort of example of this, but when I was in my late seminary years in the Lutheran Church, a document was released which was a joint declaration on justification between the Lutherans and the Catholics. And I remember it coming out, and 500 years after Luther's sort of original disagreement. And someone was saying, "Are you all going to go back to being together now?" Yeah. Firstly, the statement we mostly agreed to stop calling each other names and misrepresenting each other's positions, which is a large part of the sorting out of these sorts of things, and recognizing that there was a reasonable amount of politics back then which contributed to the disagreements, which no longer exist. But since then, we have to acknowledge there's been, many, many, many years of other kinds of disagreements and misunderstandings and perhaps misrepresentations of each other's positions, which need to be perhaps put on the table and looked at in an equally honest light.
Yeah, I believe at the moment that the two big issues being discussed between the Catholic and the Oriental Orthodox are the question of purgatory,
Yep.
and the older question of the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father or from the Father and the Son, the filioque.
Which is a question, if I understand correctly, is across the Eastern churches, isn't it?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
That definitely divides along East and West.
Right. Yes, again, even though the Catholics would be familiar with saying it in the Creed, I'm not sure how many of them would know what was at stake in that particular question. It's an interesting point that we can be so divided by a question. Now, clearly it's significant because whenever you talk about God, everything everything matters, and particularly the natures of Christ not being divisible as if they were two separate things is a crucial point to our understanding of salvation. But it's not the sort of thing the layman in average circumstances is going to be head up about, unless you're lay people who are of a much higher quality than the average Catholic parish.
No, look, I have to be honest with you, Peter. I'm not a theologian, and I have a lot of trouble getting my head around what the issue is in the question of the procession of the Holy Spirit. I'm not quite sure I actually see the problem, but I'm as I say, I'm not a theologian. I don't really, that's not my area.
Fair enough. One of the things, let's sort of dip to a kind of similarities and differences question. Clearly, we have a creed which is almost the same in the sense of the entire understanding of God. And as you've pointed out, even when we're struggling with the wording of our professions of faith, we're often trying to aim at the same aim. We're trying to express the same truths. If you wrote down the basic structure of a mass, for example, you would see pretty much the same structure as there. But I've only been to a few, but the dozen or so Orthodox liturgies that I've been privileged to see, I won't say attended because I don't know what that means theologically, but I was allowed to stand in the foyer sort of area, nave, and watch from the outer. It's quite different to your average Catholic Mass. The differences seem to be more than just style. Would you say that's a fair point?
I think there are obviously similarities and differences.
Right.
So my understanding of the historical development is that very early on in history, the Antiochian and the Alexandrian liturgical traditions were kind of distinguished from each other. And from the Alexandrian, we developed one of the three liturgies that we currently use in the Coptic Church, the Liturgy of St. Mark, now called St. Cyril's. But the other two that we use, St. Basil's and St. Gregory the Theologian's liturgies, belong to the Antiochian tradition, from which also comes the Byzantine and the Western, the Roman liturgical tradition. So there are similarities because of the shared history there. For example, the anaphora. I'm sure you would have heard the priests say, "Lift up your hearts. We have them with the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord," and so on. There's obviously the institution narrative of the Last Supper, the bread and the wine. I think the basic structure is the same. Probably, as you mentioned, the differences come in the chanting. We still pretty much chant everything with a melody, and particularly with a melismatic chant.
Right. What's a melismatic? Sorry, I mispronounced it already. What's a melismatic chant?
So it's where you spend a long time saying single syllables. So rather than saying Amen, we would say something like
Yes.
So I won't go on because
so the old joke about Catholics turning Amen into a 23-syllable word is true of you as well.
We're well over 200 syllables. Yes. But I think the other difference is, and I probably don't know enough about the Catholic liturgy, but certainly in the Oriental liturgy, the Eastern liturgy, there's a much more sort of mystical sort of approach, a timeless approach, a spaceless approach, a sense of all things becoming one in Christ, who kind of unites us all. And that sort of is expressed in the one voice, in the one loaf of bread. We use leavened bread, not wafers. The one cup from which everyone partakes. Again, generally everyone who has the body has the blood in the Orthodox Church. So they're the kinds of differences I would probably point to. And also maybe the fact that we pray pretty much the same liturgy week after week. There really is very little, there are a few seasonal variations depending on Christmas, Easter, etc. But by and large, there's not a lot of flexibility or change that happens.
I once had a discussion with a Russian Orthodox fellow, and being a Western trained theologian, they're very concerned about when precisely the Eucharist is changed into the body and blood of Christ, and they try to nail down exactly the moment. And he was confused about our discussion, and we said, well, so when is it in the Russian liturgy? And he simply said, you just do the liturgy. You just say the liturgy. You don't mess with the mystery. You just say the liturgy. And we said, oh, but what if, no, he wouldn't take it from it. You just do the liturgy. There's a sense of in the West of trying to take things apart as if we were surgeons, or as if we had some kind of minute understanding of a mystery. And the sense I get from the Eastern Church is that they're much more ready to accept the mystery and simply be taken by it. Is that a fair comment?
Orthodox theologians have, liturgical theologians in the last century, have made they've written whole books about how the difference between Catholic and Orthodox liturgy is in that question. I think some of them sort of over-exaggerate the question, but yeah, definitely the emphasis is more on the sort of the plain significance of partaking of the body and blood of Christ, and also I think there's often there's an emphasis on the church as a whole, like the body, the people, as much as the elements of the sacrament becoming the body and blood of Christ. I think that I'm really sort of conscious when we talk about sort of East and West that these aren't really fundamental differences in sort of Eucharistic theology or liturgical theology between East and West. These are just differences of emphasis that have historical reasons for why sort of different sectors talk in different ways. So I wouldn't want to say that those are fundamental characteristics of either Eastern or Western.
But in terms of emphasis, one of the cautions I would add as a theologian is that almost every heresy that's come up has come up because someone has seen something good and emphasized it to the point where it's excluded some other good, or that its overemphasis has ended up pushing too much another way. And the opposite side of that is that almost every time the church has leaned in particular too far in one direction, it has been someone emphasizing what they're missing, which has drawn them back, if you like, towards the riches of what they're dealing with. So emphasis is a good thing. It helps us to recognize what's there in every mass. Let's say, at least from the Catholic perspective, we recognize the validity, that's the word we use, but basically the presence of Christ in our Eastern brothers and sisters' masses and in ours. And yet the way in which each of them are conducted adds a different emphasis, if you like, to what's going on there and the central mystery of our faith kind of thing. So I'd like to say each are as valuable. From my perspective, sometimes, the grass is greener. You look out across the way and you think, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had a bit more of that? What about, can I come to you, Sam, as a younger fellow, and we met, it's nearly a decade ago now, in an Eastern church. Now, this is, the person on the street would normally associate that kind of liturgy with old folk, the oldies doing all that sort of old school liturgy, or at least in the Catholic Church they would. But in fact, what I'm seeing is that younger people are much more interested in the mystery. They're much more enticed by something which is a bit otherworldly. That's not their usual experience in modern culture. Would you say that's the case for you or for your contemporaries?
I think it definitely is the case for me and for a lot of my friends too. Yeah, I think there is your listeners are probably very familiar with it, but especially as immigrants in Western countries, or the children of immigrants, a lot of young people have a sense of, we feel really keenly the kind of disenchantment of the world that sort of comes with modern secular culture. And the fact that you have on a Sunday, this sort of, you're transported into another century, it feels like, sort of, in terms of what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it looks like, that can be a very enchanting thing. And it does bring a sort of element of an other world, with a capital O, into one's everyday experience. And I think, a lot of young people do find that attractive. Although, I got to say as well, sort of growing up in the West, I'm also sort of conscious of how that mystical aspect can itself become a kind of distraction, and it can very easily become a sort of liturgical idolatry. Not that it always does, but I think that's something that, because it's so much more prominent in our Eastern Church, there's so much potential to, there's so much material there for you to make an idol out of the liturgy if you wanted to. It's something we tend to be a bit more.
Let's push that a little bit, and I'll come back to Father on this one. The purpose of if I can risk using a Western, well, it's not Western philosophical term, it's a philosophical term of accidents, if you like. The purpose of the accidents of a liturgy is to draw us into the center of the mystery, right? And if I'm understanding Sam correctly, he's saying that if we make the accidents themselves, the music, the sort of the forms themselves, the main point of us being there, that itself becomes worshipping something which is made rather than the Creator himself. Do you think that's a fair call? It's possible even to take something as beautiful as the liturgy and make that into something unhealthy?
Yeah, look, I totally agree. To give a concrete example, our chants are very long and complex and beautiful, and we generally have choirs, mostly male at the moment, and that's another thing that's happening in the church another conversation that's going on. But it takes them many years to learn to sing those tunes, which are often chanted in the ancient Coptic language, the ancient language of Egypt, which is a dead language. Nobody speaks that language. So it's very easy for someone who's invested all that time and effort to learn those Coptic tunes to then sing them without even knowing really exactly what the words mean and what they're really saying. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression. They're aware of the general sense of what's going on and how it fits into the bigger picture and so on. But, it can become something of an enticement away from the goal of that singing in the first place, which is to elevate the heart and bring it into the presence of Christ. And look, that sounds a little bit Western in itself, right? Because it's like almost, if you don't know the rational meaning of the words, then you haven't really prayed. And of course, there are prayers without words. A person might actually be genuinely lifted into the presence of God without focusing on the meaning of the words. But it is a risk. It is a temptation that's there.
Having said that, of course, if our prayer is enhanced by music, I think, was it Augustine who said, "He who sings prays twice"? or someone, I think it was him who said something like that, where if you sing a prayer, he says you're doubly praying because you're lifting all more of yourself in prayer than just intellect. The liturgies themselves can enhance us, and given how difficult it is in some circumstances to pray with how could we ever reach the proper amount of devotion to our Lord? But given how difficult that is in ordinary circumstances, why not take hold of all of the opportunities we have, all the art, the music, the beauty that we can put in, and perhaps we can talk about icons in a little while. It seems to be a no-brainer that we would simply bring everything that is good and true and beautiful into our help to help us worship, so long as Sam's pointed out, none of those become idols in themselves. But I guess I'm intrigued by the modern fascination with this mysterious religious experience. In America, a whole class of Lutheran seminarians in my time all left and became Greek Orthodox. All of them, just in one group.
There's a lot of stories like that.
Where an entire group has become enchanted with the liturgy so much that they've eventually just up and moved themselves. And I remember hearing a psychologist talk about the movie Avatar when it came out. I know this sounds a bit left field, but when it hit the cinemas, there was a post-Avatar depression syndrome where people went into Avatar and it was such bright colors and music and a different world, and they were transported out of their existence. When they came out, they were very depressed to find out reality just didn't measure up. And so they went in, and while Avatar was still screening, until it stopped screening, and they couldn't deal with it. That's a bit of a sad story if that's the pinnacle of their life. But the point is it was when they came out, they realized it was empty, because they may have been aesthetically lifted, but they weren't lifted to anything. Whereas the liturgy lifts us aesthetically, but it lifts us to something to the greatest thing of substance, which is God. And I'm intrigued by the young people who are looking not just for aesthetics, but for meaning, who are lifted into this liturgical world.
Yeah. No, that's exactly why I'm so. I think that's why I sort of added that caveat about sort of liturgical idolatry, because I think I have sort of seen, even among my own friends, that sort of there can come a sort of second disillusionment where you turn initially to the liturgy as something that is very aesthetically appealing and very sort of transporting, but then if it's not, if you don't keep the ultimate goal in mind, that all of those things are there, as you put it, to sort of as means or vehicles with which to connect to God, who gives the actual substance to life, then there can come a sort of second wave of disenchantment where you realize that what you were attracted to was the smells and the sounds and the sights, rather than the Christ who was shining through them. But like you said, it's not, the solution isn't iconoclasm. The solution isn't to get rid of those things. It's just to keep them in their proper place, and they can be very powerful.
I was just going to add, if I could briefly, that one of the areas of research I'm interested in is called embodied cognition, which is a big thing these days in cognitive science and in philosophy of mind. And it's the idea that we normally think of our thinking as being something that just happens in the brain. But it actually turns out that it's the whole body taking part in different ways in that thinking process, and even the environment around us and tools that we use and things that we interact with. All of these things are actually forming the one single integrated system out of which our thoughts come. And to isolate what goes on in the brain from what all the other stuff that's going on, you can never actually really get the full picture of your thinking, of what's going on, and your emotions, and all cognition. And I think that the genius of ancient styles of prayer that include the senses of smelling the incense and looking at the icons and so on, without knowing all this modern stuff, I think they understood that the whole person needs to be involved in that relationship with God.
Well, this is a same answer I had from a Russian Orthodox fellow that I spoke to. Being an arrogant young Lutheran seminarian, I was sent to research them. So I went in and had a talk to him, and I asked him, he led me through into the main area of the church, and I looked around and saw all the icons all over the walls. And the iconostasis I'd heard about and I'd spoken about in theology, but I hadn't seen one. And I said, aren't people distracted by all this busyness? And he said, no. He said, I'm not so arrogant as to believe that they need to be listening to my words when I preach. If a child is the boring old priest is talking and the child looks over here, St. Peter preaches to him. And if he looks over here, the angels preach to him. In other words, their senses are being assailed and they're being completely absorbed in the mystery of the liturgy.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, I learned a lot of harsh lessons going into different churches. One of the Maronites, I had a bit of a shot at. I sat through a mass of his, and he said, "Was there anything different?" And he was very hospitable, giving me a cup of tea afterwards, and said, "Was there anything different?" I said, "Yes. Well, the words of institution were different. Yeah, we use the Greek, of course, from the scriptures." And he said, "Yeah, we use the Aramaic, which Jesus actually spoke." All right, I deserved that. Yes, it's one of the questions
we use
Coptic, I would put,
which is the language that the angels speak. So I think
you could say one of the most ancient and reverent languages of the church, and be quite truthful. I'm a biblical scholarship is my area, and quite often you'll find in the textual notes at the bottom of the Greek text in particular, but also some of the Greek translations of the Old Testament, Coptic translations are some of the earliest and most authoritative witnesses to what the original translations were, because it was such an early and rich heritage. So no loss of respect there from biblical scholars. Coming back to the cultural thing, Sam, you've had your foot in, or both of you have had your foot in both worlds, here in Australia for some time now. What would you say that the Eastern cultures bring to Christianity in the West? What a couple of things that you could put your finger on and say, these are the things we believe we bring to the Western Church?
It's a tough question, because I feel in a lot of ways that's a question that I would want to leave to a Western Christian to answer. Just sort of, just say, hey, look, here we are. Is there whatever you feel in your sort of discernment of your own situation is an emphasis that complements yours? You're welcome to. But I suppose.
No, it's a very wise answer, and I'm pondering the fact that your answer itself is probably wisdom that you brought to us, because we're quite ready to tell you what we have to offer. So you've already given us something. So there you go.
The only thing, and at the risk of completely undermining the wisdom, but I mean one of the really interesting emphases that I find in Eastern Orthodox critiques of Western liturgical theology, of the sort that you were describing before, about the sort of emphasis on the moments of transformation, or the accidents versus substance, is that also in responding to that, a lot of especially Russian liturgical theologians like to bring the emphasis back on the connection between the sacrament and the people, and emphasize that it's not just the bread. I mean, obviously Catholics would agree with this too, it's just a matter of emphasis, but it's not just the bread and the wine that are transformed into the body and blood of Christ, but it's the people as well in partaking of them. So you sort of get this triangle relationship between, you've got Christ at the top, and then there's the elements of the Eucharist, but then there's the people, the human beings who partake of it as unitedly becoming the body and blood of Christ.
There's certainly an emphasis in Western liturgical theology of that nature, but what tends to accompany that in the West, when they talk about the people being an important element of that triangle, is that we tend to use that as a reason for changing the liturgy into something that is more a child of this last decade than any part of the ancient church.
Getting participation from, sort of like visible participation from the laity, is that the sort of thing?
Yes, but you can have visible participation from the laity just by singing. What we're talking about here is when they want to. The key word, which is often misused, is relevance. We've got to make the liturgy more relevant to the people, meaning it's got to sound like the pop song they heard on the radio on the way to Mass, sort of thing. I'm intrigued that many people are talking about from the Eastern perspective, about the engagement and involvement of the laity in the entire equation, without it being a direct undermining of the liturgical.
Well, it depends on who you ask, but yeah. I don't think it's direct undermining, but yeah.
Good. Father, anything to add on that one? Perhaps what the East, that you think the East has as a treasure that we might value?
Going on from that idea that Samuel mentioned about the people becoming the body and blood of Christ, I think, if I can put it this way, the West had that whole crisis over faith alone or faith and works. And the East kind of wasn't really involved in that whole discussion. And there's actually a reason why, I think, and this is how I understand it at least, I could be wrong. I think for us, it's never been a question between those two things. It's always been about something that lies behind or underneath them both, which I call being, at the risk of sounding like a continental philosopher. It's about what we are, right? It's about the nature of what we are. And from that, in Eastern Christianity, the goal is to be the image and likeness of God. The goal is to be a little Christ, by nature, by our very essence, to be transformed into that. We think of repentance not as making up for something you did wrong, but as changing the very way you think.
Is that what St. Paul means when he's in exhorting Christians to act in a certain way? He says, this is not how you learned Christ.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant. Yeah. And yeah, exactly. That learning Christ is about having the mind of Christ, thinking like Christ. The pattern, the shape of my mind and the way I see the world becomes identical to the shape of how Christ sees the world and thinks. And from this being, then comes the faith. And from it comes the works. And actually, even if you have, if you believe in the right creed with your mind and you give money to the poor, but you are not like Christ, you can still be missing the whole point, right? So I think that's, again, as Samuel said, it's not like, one side is right and one side is wrong. There's very much of that in both East and West, but it is something that I think the East emphasizes a little bit more clearly.
Right. It's interesting you say that. That the mind of Christ is emphasized in Philippians 2, 5-11, and emphasizes the very nature of Christ's love being total self-sacrificial love for us, emptying of himself and then being raised up by God. But the 1 Corinthians 13 passage about if you have all of these works and you don't actually have that central love of God, then you've lost the whole lot.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And probably our attempt to segregate things and segment them and look at them individually has led us to emphasize things. And I think this comes back to Sam's earlier point. When we talk about the obvious outpouring, the things you do, we've tended to say, oh, wait, you're just talking about works now. And often there's people in the church who are very keen on that, and they end up emphasizing social justice to the expense of other parts of doctrine. And then the other people overemphasize doctrine at the expense of action. So that's a really good point. Perhaps if I can, I've been hinting at and saying all along, I think the East has to offer us that sense of mystery and join, as you say, the coherence of everything coming together. Some things that modern scholars are very concerned about, such as the social justice angle or the involvement of the laity, are encompassed in a tradition that's so ancient, is actually something that's just not an idea that's thought about much in the West, because we see these as modern accretions, if you like. The social justice angle, what we call liberation theology, these kinds of things tend to be reactions in a particular direction, which end up dumping the whole baby with the bathwater and just going off after one emphasis. The emphasis isn't wrong, it's just the enthusiasm ends up losing everything else. So I think you could remind us, if you like, of the ancient connectedness of all these things. I'm not sure what the West has to offer you, so maybe I should take Sam's wisdom and say that. But the only thing I can think of to ask you from our perspective is, it must be frustrating sometimes being in a country where there's so few of the citizens are involved in your particular faith, and that other Christians simply don't even, some of them don't even know that you would exist. Is there some way in which our the slightly more numerous Christians in Australia could contribute in some way, if not with our theology or our perspective on liturgy, then at least with some kind of understanding and advocacy?
Look, I think two things that immediately spring to mind. One is the West, I think, has done a much better job at integrating reason with faith than the East has. There is, I think, a trend in some sectors of the Eastern Christian world to almost look down on reason, almost as being a lack of faith or, a weakness of faith. If you have to ask questions, then you don't believe properly. and I'm obviously giving an exaggerated description there. And I think that's something the East definitely needs to learn from the West, how to disagree well. Often in Middle Eastern culture, to disagree on an idea means to stop being friends. You take it personally. It's sort of like, how can you disagree with me? It's an offence.
I hope that the West has not forgotten that, but in recent political debates, we seem to have overlooked our past abilities there. I hope that our the modern public debate isn't giving you a false idea of our capacity.
There is a degree of regression, I think, happening in certain parts of the world, of the Western world.
That's a very elegant way to put it, Father. I must use that in another conversation. A degree of regression is a beautiful way of putting what I would have said a complete demise of any kind of rational debate.
But yeah, look, the second thing I'll just say quickly is in the area of charity. I have to say that the Catholic Church in particular, St. Vinny's, Mother Teresa, just in that area of practical, concrete acts of love. I think we in the East, we do have charities and so on, but we certainly don't do it as well as the West. And I think that's something we definitely benefit from.
Sam, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, those are exactly the two that I would have identified as well. I mean, I don't need to sort of restate them, but I think I would sort of, it's interesting to note that I think both of those come from the strengths that we were talking about that Eastern Christianity can bring to Western Christianity. I think the sort of flip side of the weaknesses that Father was speaking about, because for example, like the sort of whole holistic, coherent approach to liturgy and social justice and that sort of thing, I think comes from the fact that Eastern Christians weren't involved in the cultural debates that caused the sort of like the strong emphasis in the West on one side versus the other. But as a result, I think that sort of the fact that we weren't involved in those conversations mean that we're still learning to take a lot of those modern questions seriously, because the modern science and modern skepticism and social justice issues, a lot of them are new problems. I mean, social justice has always been around, but I think a lot of scientific and modern science has raised a lot of questions for faith that Western Christians have done a much better job of engaging with than Eastern Christians who can often too easily. And I don't think it's completely misguided to sort of bring mystical experience and religious experience into that conversation. But I also am wary as someone who studied philosophy. I've never been quite comfortable. A lot of Orthodox make fun of me for it, but they don't make fun of Dad because he's a priest. But I get all that.
No, that doesn't stop some people.
That's true. That's true. Because I do have friends who sort of say, "Oh, why do you need philosophy? You can just sort of." That Christ, why would you need, for example, to look at historical apologetics for the resurrection? Because you know that Christ is risen just by attending the Easter liturgy and feeling him rise in your heart. And like I said, I don't think that's completely misguided. I think there's a very important point there about the fact that, the resurrection isn't just a historical event. It's something that is a real, concrete, tangible part of any Christian life. So I think that emphasis is valid. But at the same time, I can't help the fact that I'm a sort of modern Western person who studied history at university. So I want to know if the historical evidence sort of flatly disproves whether that Jesus existed at all, or whether you can possibly be a rational, a good historian and believe that Christ rose from the dead. Those questions are still important to me, and I don't feel comfortable using my experience to sort of sidestep those questions. So I think that, and the same with social justice. I think because we can tend to be such cultural bubbles. Like I said, you sort of step into a different century every Sunday, which is nice in some ways, but it also can become a shield to protect us from the need to engage with issues, the needs of our neighbors right next to us.
Yeah. It's a really good point you make there about there is a kind of a liturgical revival amongst the young people of the Catholic Church. And when I say kind of a liturgical revival, I'm very conscious of who I'm talking to here. And when we talk about a liturgical revival, we've recovered some of the beauty of the majesty of mystery of the Mass. But in some cases, it's come at the expense of charity. And that's too high a price to pay. And I'm very much endeared to a beautiful liturgy. I travel quite a way to get to one. Yeah, the expense of charity is too high a price because it's the cost you're paying there is Christ. Because as you said, you can't lose Christ at the center of it all.
One of the theologians who really influenced me, sort of growing up and still today, is Father Alexander Schmemann, who was a Russian liturgical theologian who wrote a lot about orthodoxy in the West. And one of his big sort of take-home messages in all his writings is that the liturgy is a pattern for life. And so he has this sort of emphasis on he sort of picks it up with, or Henri Nouwen picks it up in the Latin, right? The priest dismisses the people with missa est, and he'd like to emphasize that that's a reminder that the liturgy is a mission, right? It's at the end of the liturgy, you're sent out to then carry what you've seen, or to be a witness of what you've seen in the world outside you. So I think, that's I'm just adding that on that point of liturgy leading or informing our social justice and practical work as Christians.
If I can get all Western on you, there's a Latin saying lex orandi, lex credendi. And
that's one of Schmemann's favorite phrases, actually. So yeah.
There you go. And sometimes added lex vivendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief or law of the heart, and lex vivendi, which becomes the law of life. And as an Old Testament scholar, the prophets are always on about worship because they know that you get your worship right and then you understand God, and therefore you cannot help but love your neighbor. And if you're loving your neighbor, your worship is always going to be if you fail to love your neighbor, your worship is always going to be wrong because you haven't brought the heart into the worship. That sounds about the time to wrap up the podcast for this week. That's it for this week's podcast. So if today's discussion got you thinking, arguing with your podcast device, or you have some more input and you think we've forgotten something, well, of course we have, because 45 minutes is way, way too short to talk about all these issues. But you can subscribe to the podcast at thiscatholiclife.com.au. You can tell us what you like, what you didn't like, what you'd like us to discuss. Perhaps we should have these two gentlemen back and talk about the things we've missed. Hit us up on any of the social medias, Facebook, Discord, Instagram, Twitter, and give us a review on iTunes if you can. Before we go, we normally have a shout out to people, just a hello or an acknowledgement of someone. So, Sam, would you like to shout out to anybody?
So I should probably shout out to our Coptic Theological College, where Dad and I both teach and work. So if you want to, anyone wants to learn more about Oriental Orthodox theology and Eastern Christianity, liturgy, and biblical studies from an Eastern Christian approach and that sort of thing, just look up stcyrils.edu.au, and I think that's good for me. Good.
Father?
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to any Indigenous listeners who are listening today. It's been obviously a topic on the news lately, And it's something that I feel like that's something we have in common, in whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or whatever you might be. We all need to care for each other and look after each other.
Indeed. Well said. In fact, you pinched my shout out, so I'm going to join my voice to yours and say, rather than being swept up with, not that overseas issues aren't things we shouldn't be concerned about, but we do have a lot to be thinking about here in Australia in terms of not just our history, but our present practice. And in Sydney, we have such a wide variety of cultures here that we should at least be aware of the value and the care we need to take in not just preserving those cultures, but respecting people from different backgrounds and cultures. And I think that's particularly the case in case of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So, well said. That's all for now. Thank you for listening to This Catholic Life.